A fertilizer is any natural or synthetic substance that supplies one or more of the 17 essential plant nutrients. The three broad categories of fertilizers include synthetic inorganic, natural organic, and synthetic organic. There is no perfect fertilizer, and each has its advantages and disadvantages. I'm Dr. DeBusk, and this video will focus on the types of fertilizers and the best management practices for fertilizing turf. The first type of fertilizer is the synthetic inorganics. These are man-made and inorganic, meaning they do not contain carbon. The most common nitrogen sources are ammonium nitrate and ammonium sulfate. These sources are water-soluble, so they directly release nutrients as a quick-release formula, although it may be too quick. The response period for quick-release sources of nitrogen is typically 30 days. If too much is put on at one time, it may burn the foliage due to the high salt content. Some synthetic inorganics, such as ammonium sulfate, are acidifying agents and can decrease the soil pH. This is beneficial if your soil pH is too high or your plant prefers a lower pH. Since these nitrogen sources are directly released, it may stimulate lush overgrowth at the expense of root growth. Without the root growth, it is more susceptible to stresses such as drought, heat, insects, and diseases, and heavy traffic. Synthetic sources are more inexpensive and most commonly seen in stores. The next type of fertilizer is natural organic fertilizers. These come from animal and plant waste such as sewage sludge, fish bone meal, blood meal, and manure. These fertilizers actually feed the soil rather than directly feed the plant, so they must be broken down by microorganisms in order to release the nutrients. Therefore, they are considered slow release. An example of a turf fertilizer that is a natural organic fertilizer is inorganic. If you have ever used it, you know that it is a bit stinky. I've used a landscape fertilizer mainly for my ornamentals called Green Edge that is also a natural organic. They have very low salt content, but they are low in nutrients, so you have to apply much higher rates for the same effect. Natural organics are also more expensive. The last type of fertilizer is synthetic organics. This means that they are man-made but contain carbon. Urea is the most common synthetic organic and acts more like a synthetic inorganic since it quickly releases nutrients. It is commonly used in fertilizer mixes since it is high in nitrogen. In order to avoid the quick release of urea, the granule is often coated with a polymer or sulfur, commonly labeled as sulfur-coated urea. A common example for coated product for ornamentals is Osmocote, although it is most often used for houseplants and other potted plants. It has a polymer coating and is considered controlled release. Other slow-release types include IBDU and urea formaldehyde. The nutrients are released slowly through either the breakdown from water or micronutrients depending on the fertilizer. An increase in soil temperature often causes the coating to break down quicker. You always want to incorporate the fertilizer by either mixing it in or watering it in so that the sun doesn't crack any coatings or degrade the particle. The slow-release fertilizers tend to be longer lasting with less of a growth surge compared to synthetic inorganic fertilizers. Unfortunately, it does tend to be more expensive. The fertilizer tag or label contains a lot of important information that needs to be followed. You will always see three numbers on the front, which is the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, abbreviated NPK in that order. Technically, the fertilizer tags label phosphorus and potassium in the oxide forms, so P2O5 and K2O, but thankfully soil tests and other landscapers generalize it a bit more. So what do these numbers mean? If you have 100 pounds of a 12-4-8 fertilizer, you would have in the bag 12 pounds of nitrogen, 4 pounds of phosphorus, and 8 pounds of potassium. These are also percentages. So 12% of the bag is nitrogen, 4% is phosphorus, and 8% is potassium. This is called the fertilizer analysis or grade. On a soil test, you may also be given a ratio such as 3:1:2 or 3:0:1. Now we have to go back and do a little algebra and common denominators. If you look at 12:4:8, what can they all be divided by? They can be divided by 4. If you do that, that leaves a ratio of 3:1:2. A fertilizer analysis of 18:6:12 would also have a ratio of 3:1:2. A soil test may also recommend a complete fertilizer. This simply means that the fertilizer has all three nutrients and none of the numbers are zero. The analysis of fertilizer used should be based on the results of your soil analysis. In addition to the grade or analysis of the fertilizer, the label also identifies the breakdown of total nitrogen as either nitrate nitrogen, ammoniacal nitrogen, water-soluble or urea nitrogen, and water-insoluble nitrogen. The reason why this is important is that for all counties in Florida, you have to pay attention to how much slow-release or slowly available nitrogen there is. Some counties require that turf fertilizers have 30% or more slow-release nitrogen, and others require 50% or more. Therefore, a calculation is involved. The amount of slowly available nitrogen is actually found below the ingredients, often distinguished with a star. In order to calculate the percentage of slow-release nitrogen, divide the slowly available nitrogen by the total nitrogen and multiply it by 100%. For the top example, 4% is listed as being slowly available, and the total nitrogen is 6%. So the slow-release nitrogen would be 66.7%. For the second example, the slow-release nitrogen is even higher, at 72.5%. Don't let the examples fool you because many fertilizers have very low percentage of slow-release nitrogen. For turf grass as well as ornamentals, the application rates are based on the nitrogen content of the fertilizer. The pounds of fertilizer that needs to be applied per 1,000 square feet is determined by dividing 100 by the nitrogen percentage. You never want to apply more than 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. Here's an example of this. If you have a fertilizer with an analysis of 20-0-10, you would divide 100 by 20, which equals 5 pounds of 20-0-10 per pound of nitrogen. This means that if you have a 1,000 square foot area to apply fertilizer, you would fill your spreader with 5 pounds of the fertilizer and spread it evenly over the area. This will provide 1 pound of nitrogen. As of 2007, the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, FDACS, adopted a rule that regulates products that can be used to fertilize home lawns. The Urban Turf Fertilizer Rule regulates what can be sold and marketed as lawn fertilizer and requires specific wording on the fertilizer bag. This rule was enacted in response to concerns over potential pollution of water resources resulting from the nitrogen and phosphorus in these fertilizers. The rule requires that specific guidelines for nitrogen and phosphorus application rates be followed. The amount of nitrogen that can be applied at any one time is determined by the time of year and percentage of slow-release nitrogen in the fertilizer. This rule allows for application of up to 2 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet when applying fertilizer in the spring or summer, although local ordinances often reduce this to 1 pound. Not more than 1 pound of total nitrogen per 1,000 square feet per application may be applied during the fall or winter, although several Florida counties have winter fertilization bans. No more than 0.7 pounds of soluble quick-release nitrogen per 1,000 square feet can be applied at any one time. For phosphorus application, a maximum of 0.25 pounds of phosphorus of P2O5 per 1,000 square feet is allowed per application, with no more than 0.5 pounds allowed annually. No additional phosphorus can be applied unless a soil test indicates that phosphorus levels are deficient. The most common method for applying dry fertilizers in landscape settings is through rotary and drop spreaders. Rotary spreaders have a larger spread across the area, which provides more even distribution and less heavy overlap between the rows. Drop spreaders drop fertilizer right below the device. In order to calibrate these spreaders, you must determine their spread. You always want to calibrate your spreader, especially when you change fertilizers. The fertilizer tag will have a recommended setting for that spreader, but those settings may be off, and it may be applying too much or too little fertilizer. In order to calibrate the spreader, you need to have a trial pass on a hard, smooth site. You can spread a tarp out to collect the fertilizer, although some do it directly in the grass. You first need to measure the spread of your fertilizer, then measure a length that will make it easy to calculate. In this example, there is an 8-foot spread and 25-foot length, making the test patch 200 square feet. Assuming a 15-10-10 fertilizer formulation, we will use the previous formula to calculate how much fertilizer would be needed to apply 1 pound of nitrogen. In this case, it is 6 pounds. To see how much fertilizer would be applied to the test plot, which is 200 square feet, you would set up a proportion and cross-multiply. For 200 square feet, you would need to apply 1.2 pounds of fertilizer. You would set your spreader according to what the fertilizer tag says initially and place over the 1.2 pounds in the spreader, maybe 5 pounds. Apply the fertilizer and either sweep up the granules and weigh them, or weigh the fertilizer before, in this case 5 pounds, and after, and take the difference. The weight should be 1.2 pounds for the 200 square feet. If it is not, then adjust the spreader and repeat the process until the delivery rate is right. There are several best management practices to prevent fertilizer burns. Do not apply more than 0.7 pounds of water-soluble nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. Spread the fertilizer evenly so that clumping does not exceed the rate. Avoid overlap or spillage. Apply to dry foliage. Applying to wet foliage causes it to stick to the blades. Apply granules or pellets rather than dust, which tend to drift and are harder to handle. And most important, water immediately after application. You should irrigate fertilizer in with only enough water to move granules off of the leaves, which is about 1/4 of an inch. It is everyone's responsibility to follow these BMPs on how to properly apply fertilizer and avoid potential situations where we might get leaching of fertilizers or chemicals into ground or surface waters. First, sweep up any fertilizer spills. Excess fertilizers should not remain on impervious surfaces that run off into storm drains. When you are near waterways, use a buffer zone around waterways to reduce potential for surface water pollution when fertilizing. Fertilizing in the water can lead to algal blooms, which is devastating to waterways. The minimum size for the buffer zone is 3 feet if you are using a deflector shield and 10 feet if you are not using a shield. Keep in mind that local ordinances may require a larger buffer zone. Establishment and recovery are special situations. The goal is to get the environmental benefits of a solid cover of turf grass as quickly as possible, and this may require fertilization above what established turf requires. Nitrogen and potassium are used to promote a thick, vigorous stand of turf. Use phosphorus only when a soil test indicates there is a need. The best management practices for retaining nutrients on the lawn is a dense stand of turf. You should practice the following measures. New sod should not be fertilized with nitrogen for the first 30 days until it has firmly rooted into soil. Plugs can be fertilized at the time of installation to encourage the runners to spread. A quick, complete ground cover is the ultimate goal. Newly seeded areas should not receive nitrogen fertilizer until a cover has been established and roots have pegged down, usually about 30 days. For new turf establishment only, soil test results may indicate a one-time application of up to 1 pound of phosphorus per 1,000 square feet is needed to encourage root growth. This should not be applied until 30 days after planting. For recovery, soluble fertilizers may be necessary to provide a rapid response on weakened turf. Lower total rates of soluble fertilizer can produce desired turf improvement when applied frequently. When nutrients cannot be applied as frequently, use a slow-release fertilizer. Iron and manganese may be useful to improve color, especially in neutral or alkaline soils. Micronutrients may provide an initial color response while nitrogen thickens the turf and improves root development. In conclusion, I hope you learned more about fertilizers, fertilizer tags, and fertilizing turf.